The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, as the diggers called the Papuan stretcher bearers, provided an invaluable service to the beleaguered diggers, taking supplies and ammunition to the front and bringing the wounded back on stretchers.
The carriers provided our only lifeline, in for supplies and out for the wounded. And they were overworked and overloaded, and many of them died on the job. With the wounded, they were absolutely devoted to the task, and I think someone spoke of their devotion as being like the care of a nurse and the love of a mother.
Without the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, many more diggers would have died on the track. Indeed, if a wounded or sick digger couldn't walk out, it was either a Fuzzy Wuzzy stretcher or death.
They go right up to front line, and we hand it over them, and they carry all that raggy down up in Kokoda. They all came back with rain, even rain, carriers done a good job, and I saw it with my own eyes. And the carriers should be respected, like the army.
When the 39th Battalion was eventually given a break from the front line, the survivors rallied at Manari, a tiny village about halfway down the track. The legendary Australian cinematographer Damien Parra was there to record the moment.
At Manari the next morning, I received a message from Potts congratulating the 39th on the job they'd done under his command and asking me to pass that message on to the 39th. So I had my first battalion parade at Manari.
We did our best to put on a good front, although some of us hadn't eaten for a long time. We had odd boots, some had split boots. We all had sticks to help us climb through the mud. Some we had dysentery. I didn't even have a weapon. Matter of fact, I didn't have a Dixie or a mess tin to have my meal. But we proudly tried to do our best to stand our attention for a colonel honour.
The campaign now hung in the balance. The real cause for the near disaster on the Kokoda track was a faulty strategic appreciation in Australia. General MacArthur had his eyes on a spectacular offensive against Rabaul. And despite intelligence which showed that the Japanese would possibly come over the Owen Stanley Mountains, neither MacArthur nor General Blamey, commanding the Australian Army, really believed that they would do so. About this time, there was a tendency to panic in some elements of the Australian government, and this put pressure on the senior Australian commanders. MacArthur and Blamey felt that their own positions were under threat, and when things went wrong in New Guinea, they tended to blame the men on the spot. And of course, this has left a legacy of bitterness from the men who were there on the spot.
I can't credit Blamey with any military intelligence. They were given all the information they had, and they refused to accept it if it wasn't what they wanted. They refused to accept that the Japanese were attacking us, and we were holding them against immense odds. And they decided that, or at least MacArthur decided, that they had to publicise that the Australians were retreating. And Blamey accepted that they were running away from inferior numbers. When I came back, I reported to Raoul, and he said, I'm sending you to Blamey tomorrow morning. He's here in Supreme Command, and he'll want to hear from you. And so I spruced myself up somehow and reported to Blamey the next morning, as all arranged. He said, oh, good morning, Honor. You've just arrived in Moresby from Australia, have you? I said, no, sir. I've been in Papua for some time. And we dwindled off onto other topics. The war was never mentioned. The Maroubra campaign, which was in full flight, this is when they were on Brigade Hill and fighting for their lives. A matter of no importance to him. He didn't know who I was. I'd been his commander of the Australian forces opposing the Japs. He didn't know. He didn't care.
The leaders did realise the problems of supplying the frontline troops. They had established an airdrop zone in some dry lakes near the summit of the Owen Stanleys at a place the Australians called Myola.
The bearer line brought in some supplies, but they also supplemented for the first time, I think, with aerial dropping, and that was, of course, very much a hastily improvised sort of an operation where they hadn't learned how to pack things for dropping and that sort of thing. For instance, small bags of rice or sugar or anything like that were just simply tossed out of the plane. They often burst when they hit the ground, and of course there was an appreciable loss. Later on, of course, they learned to put a small bag inside a bigger bag, and then when the small bag burst, well, the bigger bag, of course, saved the loss. But they also dropped some 3-inch mortars to us there, but of course we never saw them. They went into swampy ground, and well, nobody ever found them. And so it was, I think somebody did tell me that there was something like a 40% recovery.
The Australians were by now experienced and effective jungle fighters. Despite their poor preparation, the disparity in firepower and the constant lack of supplies, they had ingeniously adapted to the conditions. The conditions on the track were as great an obstacle as the enemy. Malaria and scrub typhus were rife, and the grueling stress of battle took a constant toll.
There's 29 balls under my boots, and my socks had rotted off, and I'd cut the jumper out of my sleeves out of my jumper and use those as socks because we had no dressings or anything. It was just, they just suppurating all the time, of course, and that's why whenever I sat down, I used to take my shoes and boots and socks off to let a bit of air in. And one of them in particular, on top of this instep, it was right through from the sole to the top, you know, it was just a hole through. You could put your hand at the bottom or the top and pick up a core, you know. But, you know, you just kept on going, you know, there's nothing you can do about it.
Most of the time, the Australians were forced to endure the savage onslaught of an increasingly desperate enemy as they contested every yard of the jungle killing fields.
Pushing our way through the jungle, we came across heavy fire, and all of a sudden a burst of machine gun came across me and blew the submachine gun to pieces, and that's when I realised I'd been hit. I dropped, and then I realised I'd been hit in more places when I'd lost my arm, been hit under the chin and hit through the chest and the leg. As I left the RAP, I was told by my medical officer, Blue Stewart, that I had no chance of getting back to Moresby because he didn't think I had any health, my health was good enough to get there. After him dressing my wounds and amputating my arm, we moved out with 4 Papuans carrying me, and at that stage they told me that it would be approximately 5 or 6 days before I got back to Port Moresby. It turned out to be it was 12 days before he got back.
I don't think I'm a hard man, I think I'm a soft man. But you get used to the fact that people are dying around you. And unlike the pictures, they don't die screaming or yelling. They die quietly. They're not moaning and groaning particularly, except unless they're unconscious. And if they're wounded, they usually keep fighting until they do die. They didn't throw their lives away recklessly, but almost calmly, knowing they were doing their duty and going to their death calmly. I particularly think of blokes like Lefty Langridge and Claude Nye, one with a company of the 2nd 16th and one with a company of the 2nd 14th, who were ordered to go around the right flank where the bulk of the Japanese were to try and force a way through them to Brigade Hill. They knew they couldn't do it. They knew they were going to die. Langridge handed over his pay book and his dog tags to one of his mates. He was a brave soldier. So was Claude Nye. They were both killed. Actually, out of the 2 companies, about 6 men got through.
Soon after midday, many Australian soldiers came and fired for more than an hour. Many Australians were killed. Most of us were killed as well. Only 8 soldiers survived. The platoon leader was killed, and it's only me who could lead the other 8 surviving soldiers. I contacted the headquarters of the 5th Battery behind us. However, no assistance was received. We had to keep our position with only 8 of us. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, many Australian soldiers came down. By that time, we had lost 7 out of 8. I was the only survivor. I reached for a gun belonging to a dead soldier and prepared for the next fight. This is my helmet. I was wearing this at Efogi when an Australian put the barrel of a brain gun against my helmet and pulled the trigger. I tried to jump out of the hole I was in. Just as I jumped up, he pulled the trigger and the bullet broke my helmet. But I wasn't shot in the head. I was shot twice in the shoulder. I ripped the strap and threw the helmet away, and the Australian soldier ran away, so I ran after him. And I pulled out my bayonet from my hip, and I stabbed the Australian. I stabbed him here, but it hit his rib bone, and he didn't die. The Australian pulled out the bayonet because it was hurting him, and he kicked me in the stomach. I was thrown head over heels, but I knew that if I didn't do something, I'd be shot. So I grabbed him in bear hug, but I was wounded, so I couldn't use my right arm, so I only used one arm. So I grabbed him with one arm, but he was a big man. He had a bayonet in his belt, so I pulled out his bayonet and I stabbed him with his own bayonet. The Australian soldier said, "Ooh," and fell down. There was a tree, and he was lying down next to the tree like this. Every so often, he would lift his head up and look at me. I had also been shot, and I'd lost a lot of blood, and I couldn't see anymore. I was lying on my back and looking at the Australian. Every time he lifted his head, it sounded as though he was going to get up. So I would start to get up as well. And then the Australian would fall down again, lie down again. And we continued doing this all night, looking at each other and doing our best. When morning came, the Australian soldier was dead.
Corporal Kokichi Nishimura of the 144th Regiment was one of the many whose lives were irreparably affected by the Kokoda track. Amidst the carnage at Efogi, Nishimura-san made a solemn promise.
Those of us who were left promised each other that those who survived would come back after the war and pick up the bones of those who died. I feel the promise is a duty, which I must fulfill for the rest of my life. Actually, I have a wife and child, but when I decided to go to Papua New Guinea, my wife and my child opposed this. But I decided to sell off my land, all my assets, cut all my links with my family, and return to Papua New Guinea as a single man, and carry out my promise to my comrades who died in the war.
And that's exactly what Kokichi Nishimura did in 1979. From his tiny base in Popondetta near the track, he has spent the last 12 years honoring his promise to his fallen comrades.
At the Battle of Efogi, my platoon consisted of 42 men. The others all died. At the moment, the only person who came back from the Battle of Efogi is me, and me alone. And because I have the duty to fulfill my promise, I'm still trying hard to keep my promise to my comrades. It's now 40-something years since the fight at Efogi ended, and I've finally been able to start collecting the skeletons. Whenever I go looking for skeletons, all that's left is legs. There's no upper bodies to any of the skeletons. And all the legs always have boots on their feet. I think that maybe they're waiting for me. If I dig a hole next to the feet I find, again I find more legs with no upper body, and again they've got shoes on. And they're waiting for me. No matter what skeleton I find, there's always only the legs. Only the legs. To me, that means that my friends are waiting for me. The upper bodies have gone, but the legs and the shoes are waiting for me because they want me to take them home to Japan.
The 2nd 16th and 2nd 14th Battalions continued their gallant rearguard fight until they were down to a handful of fit men. They made their final stand at WWII.
It was a dreadful battle in many ways because we'd gone over, in our battalion, 546 strong, and at that stage we were rapidly reaching our final figure of 90. We were sitting on a forward slope at WWII, and the Japs were there with their heavy guns, their infantry weapons and their mountain gun. And one by one they picked our fellas off. And it was a dreadful position to be in. The fellas were tired, and to see their mates just going one by one at every sound of the mountain gun was pretty devastating.
And every shot somebody got killed. I think there was 7 killed on the day. This bloody thing would go off. All you'd hear was crack over your head and duck. It was too late to duck. It was there. Sidney Johnson, I suppose, was the worst hit. He was a band sergeant. Shouldn't have been there at all. Well, Sid had a hole that size in there. The field dressing, the big one, just sat in it. And Sid said to me, he said, "Dad, save me." And he was talking through there, not through here. He was breathing through there. We got him out, but...
We worked really hard and finally got up to the mountain at WWII. We looked down and we could see the sea. We could see the searchlights from Port Moresby. We'd gone more than 90% of the way toward the goal. But our stores had run out. Our rations had run out. The initial plan was for the 144th Battalion to attack. A frontal assault down the hill against the Port Moresby, while men from other units landed from the sea behind Port Moresby. But that plan failed because Guadalcanal was threatened, and the men were sent off to Guadalcanal. Because we couldn't do it, the order was issued to fall back and go back down the track.
The tide of battle had turned, and the Japanese found themselves plagued by the same supply and reinforcement problems which had dogged the Australians earlier. But while the Japanese advance had petered out, the resolve and courage of the individual troops held firm, even under the most extreme pressure, as they fought a withdrawal back to the beaches at Buna and Gona, where they had landed some 2 months before.
The 3rd Battalion was overrun by Australian troops. There were many deaths. Australians came to within 5 meters of the regimental flag. I remember now what they said.
Fire, fire, quick, quick,
I decided the regimental colors were in danger because the enemy had come so close, and so I shouted to the commander of the battalion, "What shall I do with the flag?" And he told me to burn it. It was the custom that whenever the flag was destroyed, the flag bearer had to die with it. Usually, we would put gasoline on the flag and set fire to it with the match, but there was no time. So I saw towards the left there was a hut on fire. So I held the flag and threw gasoline over my steel helmet and onto my body and jumped into the hut. As soon as I jumped into the hut, the flag and myself burst into flames. I intended to die, but as soon as I jumped into the hut, it was extremely painful and I rolled around on the floor. I fell in the well on the floor and of course the flame went out. I was no longer burning. It became dark, and when it became totally dark, the Australian troops pulled out. Then the representative of the battalion commander, a man named Shimada, came to me and said, "What did you do with the flag?" I apologized that the flag wasn't burned yet and explained why. And he said, "Bring it with you." I couldn't walk. I couldn't see. I had been burned all over my body. So I asked him to take the flag, and I gave it to him.
Whilst we were there at Imata, after we came down from Urabawa, we got our first sound of one of our own weapons going overhead, a 25-pounder. It was music. We'd been on the receiving end for long enough, and the blokes were feeling pretty downcast about this. We had no things that could send anything back at them, and we just spent a few days at Urabawa with this mountain gun hammering away, and the sound of those 25-pounders going overhead was absolutely beautiful. I thought, you little beauties, you know, mix that with your rice, as the great Alan Hattie used to say. He used to have that famous saying, "Mix that with your rice, you little so-and-sos," as he threw a grenade. And that's what we all thought when the 25-pounder went over.
There were a lot of men who couldn't move, and because we'd been ordered to leave, we had to leave them there. So we gave them grenades, and we gave them instructions. When the enemy comes, you must throw the first grenade at the enemy and kill yourselves with the second grenade. And then we left them there, and we crossed the river. This is one of my worst memories of the war.
Oh, I think killing men at close range was the most horrifying thing, to see their eyes just about turn up. They're just as frightened of dying as what you and I are frightened of dying. It's not and I think to know that you see a wounded man, then you call on him to surrender, and he puts a grenade up to his mouth and pulls the pin out and you shoot him. But he was a helpless individual. You would be prepared to help him. He didn't want your help.
During the advance along the track, we really felt that we had to get to Port Moresby and capture it as quickly as possible. And the troops broke out at each obstacle along the road to break through to Port Moresby, and we really fought hard. However, when we got to Iwolibaira, we were told to turn around and go back, and when the retreat began, we just lost our spirit. The withdrawal turned into a dash, and escape down to Gilwa. On the way through Gilwa, we held our heads high and felt great. But on the way back, we hung our heads. When things get really bad, when you get no food and you can't do your duty, all that's left is death. But when you get to that stage, something within you comes out and say, "I don't want to die." Some other soldiers talk about the emperor or the spirit, the esprit de corps of the army. But for me, it was my mother, my mum. My thoughts of my mother remained in my heart. My mother said to me before I left, "You mustn't die. Come home. You must come home." So for me, it was my mother.
It took the 7th Australian Division another month before they drove the Japanese South Seas Force back to Kokoda. And then it was a further 2 months before a reinforced corps of Australians and Americans defeated the Japanese in the beachheads at Buna and Gona. Combined with the Guadalcanal Campaign, The Kokoda Campaign marked the turning point of the war in the Southwest Pacific. No longer would the Japanese be able to pose a direct threat to Australia. Using Port Moresby and the Buna area as a base, the Allies advanced along the north coast of New Guinea, and about a year later, the Japanese cut their losses and went to a strategic defensive in the New Guinea area. In terms of the direct effect on Australia, Kokoda was the most important battle fought by the Australians in the Second World War. And in its general importance to Australia, Kokoda ranks right up there in importance with the legendary Gallipoli Campaign.
In the tradition of its forebears, the 144th Regiment fought to the last. Only a small portion of the invading force was able to escape by ship from their Buna-Gona beachheads. The Nonkai Shatai's final casualty list was devastating. Perhaps 90% of those who landed in Papua New Guinea never returned home to Japan. The Japanese and the Australians were unyielding foes in the fetid jungles of the Owen Stanleys. But the passing of time has seen the old enemies come together, bonded by a mutual respect and a common desire to ensure their grandchildren never have to endure the horrors of war to which they were subjected. Since 1979, the diggers of the 39th Battalion and the Japanese veterans of the 144th Regiment have held joint commemorative services. Perhaps this alliance, unique in modern warfare, will ensure that the sacrifices of the thousands of young men who never returned from the bloody track will not have been in vain.
In retrospect, we can see that they were just the same sort of people as we were. And I suppose that's one of the stupid things about war, isn't it?
These days, it's something we want to forget. We all want to forget as much as possible. But also, the first things we should say is you shouldn't have war. And I want to teach my children and my grandchildren war is something that you shouldn't do. To tell the children not to have, not to take part in war is the duty of we, the survivors.
I think everybody has realised the futility of war for one thing, that there just isn't anything to be gained by it. And so far as the attitude towards the Japanese were concerned, I've mellowed over the years. I'm afraid I had to, because living up here in Queensland, of course, and jogging down to the coast sometimes on a weekend, you felt that if you didn't mellow, you know, it could be nasty. But yeah, I've mellowed, and I realised that they were fighting for a cause the same as we were.
I don't like politics, and I don't like talking about the war. I think it's very sad, but at the time we had to fight for Japan. We were told to fight for the nation or for our family, but remembering those men who died, now I really think that it was meaningless. It's very sad.
When I was little, I was lonely and used to take my dog Esu to the beach. As someone told me, the ocean continues to New Guinea, where my father was. Even on rainy days, I stood at the beach with an umbrella up. On Mother's Day, my friends were wearing a red carnation on their breast, but I wore a white one. Every night in bed, grandmother stroked Motoko's hair and cried, saying she should have died instead of father or mother.
Father, I have come to see you. Thanks to your fellow soldiers of the Koch New Guinea Association, I came to see you after 49 years. I'm very sorry I didn't come earlier. I have elected your tombstone. I will come to see you again. Please rest your soul. I want to take you home, Father. Father, I want to take you.